Inside of this callback function, we are now adding a new event listener for the new request. And so here we now have one callback inside of the other one. All right. And so we will talk about that once we have this code working. But for now, let's actually take a look at the result here. And so that's going to be request, or actually just a this keyword. So this dot response text. So let's see. And indeed, now we got data about Spain. And no matter how many times we reload the page, it will now always appear after Portugal. All right, because there's no way that this AJAX call here can be made before the one on Portugal. Okay, and so now, well, let's just do the same as we did here. So we don't need this. Let's say data2 should be JSON.parse and then this. And of course, we need to also destructure it then, logging it to the console. But now we get some error here. So let's just take a look at the result itself without any destructuring. Oh, and so now it works. And the reason for that is that the response of this API is actually no longer an array when we search for the code. So here we have this alpha, remember, and so this time we are searching for country codes and not for country names. And so the country codes are unique, and so therefore they can always just be one result. And so that's the reason why no array is returned. And probably it says here so in the documentation. Well, it doesn't say so, but if we would have just simply inspected the response here, then we would have understood that as well. But anyway, now it worked, and so let's now render this country here as well. So data2, and now let's wait, and there it is. Great. Now actually I created a special class here for the neighboring country so that it appears a little bit smaller. And so when it is the neighbor, we want to attach some class here to the country. And so let's pass that class in. So let's say class name, and by default we set it to nothing. So here we will just add it to the string like this. And now when it is a neighbor, we can just pass in neighbor like this. Give it a save. And yeah, so that looks a bit nicer. We get the information that this is a neighbor country. And so now let's try this, for example, for the USA as well. But now I just want to do one at a time. So here we should probably get Mexico or Canada. And indeed, here it is. Here is Canada, the neighboring country of the US. And so one more time, this second AJAX call would not have been possible without the first one. Because otherwise, how would we know that the second country here needed to be Canada? Okay, so again, we have one AJAX call here that depends on another one. And so what we have here is one callback function inside of another one. So you see, here we attach the first callback function, and then inside of that, we have yet another one. So in other words, here we have nested callbacks. But now imagine that we wanted to do more requests in sequence, like the neighbor of the neighbor of the neighbor, and like 10 times over. So in that case, we would end up with callbacks inside of callbacks, like 10 times. And actually, for that kind of structure and for that kind of behavior, we have a special name. And that special name is callback hell. So basically, callback hell is when we have a lot of nested callbacks in order to execute asynchronous tasks in sequence. And in fact, this happens for all asynchronous tasks which are handled by callbacks, and not just AJAX calls. So, for example, let's say we have a setTimeout function, and then here we want to log something to the console like 1 second passed, but then also we want to start another timeout. Let's just set 1000 here. So let's copy this one here. And so, as I just said, let's say that here we wanted to start a new timer after the first timer has finished. So here we can say 2 seconds passed, and we can even add another one. So never mind about what just happened in the console. And here, why not add yet another one? All right. And so now they should appear like 1, 2, 3, 4. And so here too, of course, we have callback hell. And in fact, callback hell is pretty easy to identify by this triangular shape that is formed here. You see that? And also the same is starting to appear here. Right? So if we had more callbacks in here, then we would start to see a lot more indentation here. And then this triangular shape would also appear there. Now, the problem with callback hell is that it makes our code look very messy. But even more important, it makes our code hard to maintain and very difficult to understand and to reason about. And code that is hard to understand and difficult to reason about will have more bugs and is just worse code. So this is a great rule that you should always remember and keep in mind. So again, the rule is that code that's hard to understand is basically bad code because it will have more bugs. Because the harder it is to understand code and to reason about the code, the more difficult it will be to add new features and to add more functionality to the application. But anyway, given all these problems with callback hell, we of course need a way to solve callback hell. And fortunately for us, since ES6, there is actually a way of escaping callback hell by using something called promises. And so let's now take the next step in our journey of asynchronous JavaScript, which is to learn all about promises. In the last video, we got a glimpse into callback hell, and it was not pretty. So in this lecture, let's learn about a modern JavaScript feature called promises so that we can escape callback hell. However, before we learn about promises, we should actually see one. And so let's now replace the old XML HTTP request function with the modern way of making AJAX calls. And that is by using the fetch API. So let me go up here to our first function, and I will just copy all of this just to see how it used to work and how we can do it now. Okay, so this is how we used to do it, and now all we need to do is to call fetch, and then with our URL, so let's just grab that part and then specify Portugal, and that's actually it. All we have to do now is to store the result into a variable, and let's still call it request here. Now there are actually some more options that we can specify here in the fetch function if we'd like, but to make a simple GET request like this one, all we really need is to pass in the URL, and that's it. So for more complex AJAX calls, the fetch function can take in like an object of options as well. But again, for now, we don't need that. But anyway, let's now give it a save. And well, we should also log the request to the console to see what happens. And so you see that the fetch function immediately returned a promise here. So as soon as we started the request, we stored the result of that into the request variable. And then as we logged it, we immediately got the promise here. So let's do that again. And again, right away, we got something called promise. And here it says pending. So if we open that up, then here it says fulfilled. And we also have like a value here, but I'm not going to go into full detail just yet. So what matters here is that now we actually have a promise, and so this promise is right now stored in this request variable. But now, what exactly is a promise and what can we do with it? Well, let's find out. So the formal definition of a promise is that it's an object that is used basically as a placeholder for the future result of an asynchronous operation. And if that sounds weird to you, we can also say that a promise is like a container for an asynchronously delivered value. Or even less formal, let's say that a promise is a container for a future value. So there you go. That's the most distilled down definition of what a promise is. So a container or a placeholder for a future value. And a perfect example of a future value is the response coming from an AJAX call. So when we start the AJAX call, there is no value yet, but we know that there will be some value in the future. And so we can use a promise to handle this future value. And don't worry, this will really make sense once we go back to code. But to understand this concept even better, I like to use the analogy of a lottery ticket. So a promise is just like a lottery ticket. So when I buy a lottery ticket, essentially I buy the promise that I will receive some amount of money in the future if I guess the correct outcome, right? So I buy the ticket now with the prospect of winning money in the future, and the lottery draw, which determines if I get the money or not, happens asynchronously. So of course, I don't have to drop everything and keep waiting until the lottery draw happens, right? Now, in case I did get the correct outcome, then I will receive my money, because I have my lottery ticket, which is the promise that I bought. Now, what's the big advantage of using promises? Well, there are two of them actually. First, by using promises, we no longer need to rely on events and callback functions to handle asynchronous results. Events and callback functions can sometimes cause unpredictable results, and so this is a big win already. But even better, with promises, we can chain promises for a sequence of asynchronous operations instead of nesting like we did in the last video. And with this, we can finally escape callback hell, which was our initial goal all along. And by the way, promises are an ES6 feature, so they became available in JavaScript in 2015. And so by now, they are widely used by everyone. Now, since promises work with asynchronous operations, they are time sensitive, so they change over time, and so promises can be in different states. And this is what we call the life cycle of a promise. So in the very beginning, we say that the promise is pending. And so this is before any value resulting from the asynchronous task is available. Now, during this time, the asynchronous task is still doing its work in the background. Then, when the task finally finishes, we say that the promise is settled. And there are two different types of settled promises, and that's fulfilled promises and rejected promises. So, a fulfilled promise is a promise that has successfully resulted in a value just as we expected. For example, when we use a promise to fetch data from an API, a fulfilled promise successfully got that data, and it's now available to being used. On the other hand, a rejected promise means that there has been an error during the asynchronous task. In the example of fetching data from an API, an error would be, for example, when the user is offline and can't connect to the API server. Now, going back to the analogy of our lottery ticket, the lottery draw is basically the asynchronous task which determines the result. Then, once the result is available, the ticket would be settled. Then, if we guessed the correct outcome, the lottery ticket would be fulfilled and we get our money. However, if we guessed wrong, then the ticket basically gets rejected and all we did was waste our money. Now, these different states are very important to understand because when we use promises in our code, we will be able to handle these different states in order to do something as a result of either a successful promise or a rejected one. Another important thing about promises is that a promise is only settled once, and so from there, the state will remain unchanged forever. So the promise was either fulfilled or rejected, but it's impossible to change that state. Now, these different states that I showed you here are relevant and useful when we use a promise to get a result, which is called to consume a promise. So we consume a promise when we already have a promise. For example, the promise that was returned from the fetch function right at the beginning of this video. Remember? But in order for a promise to exist in the first place, it must first be built. So it must be created. In the case of the fetch API, it's the fetch function that builds the promise and returns it for us to consume. So in this case, we don't have to build the promise ourselves in order to consume it. Now, most of the time, we will actually just consume promises, which is also the easier and more useful part. And so that's what we will do in the next couple of videos. But sometimes we also need to build a promise and not just consume it. And of course, we will also learn how to do that a bit later. All right. And so now let's actually start using promises in the next video. In this lecture, we will learn how to consume a promise. And in this case, we will consume the promise that was returned by the fetch function. So let's now implement the getCountryData function from the very first lecture, but of course this one using a promise. So getCountryData, and so again, here we pass in a country, and then here we will want this fetch function, and here again with the country then. So making this a template, literal again, and then country. And as we already know, calling the fetch function like this will then immediately return a promise, so as soon as we start the request. And in the beginning, this promise is of course still pending, because the asynchronous task of getting the data is still running in the background. So just as we learned in the last lecture. Now, of course, at a certain point, the promise will then be settled, and either in a fulfilled or in a rejected state. But for now, let's assume success. So assume that the promise will be fulfilled and that we have a value available to work with. And so to handle this fulfilled state, we can use the then method that is available on all promises. So just like this. So again, this here will return a promise, and on all promises, we can call the then method. Now into the then method, we need to pass a callback function that we want to be executed as soon as the promise is actually fulfilled. So as soon as the result is available. So a function, and then this function will actually receive one argument once it's called by JavaScript. And that argument is the resulting value of the fulfilled promise. So let me call it response here, because this is the response of an AJAX call in this case. All right, and that's it. So this is how we actually handle a fulfilled promise. But now let's actually do something with the response here. And as always, I will start by logging it to the console. But of course, we also need to call this function here. All right. And so here we now get the response indeed. And even the type of this object is actually called response. Let's just get rid of this here for a second. So we have a cleaner output here. All right. And so here indeed we have a couple of things about the response itself. For example, here the status code or the headers. And so if you watch the lecture about how the web actually works behind the scenes, then this kind of data here will be familiar to you. But anyway, what we're actually interested in is the data itself. And so that data is in the response body here. So let's click here just to see. And as we see, the body is basically this readable stream. All right. And so actually, we cannot yet really look at the data here. So in order to be able to actually read this data from the body, we need to call the JSON method on the response. Okay, so JSON is a method that is available on all responses of the fetch method. So what I mean is this. So response.json. So again, the JSON method here is a method that is available on all the response objects that is coming from the fetch function. So all of the resolved values. And indeed, this response here is in fact a resolved value. And so therefore, it does have the JSON method attached to it. Now the problem here is that this JSON function itself is actually also an asynchronous function. And so what that means is that it will also return a new promise. And that's all a bit confusing, and I really don't know why it was implemented like this, but this is just how it works. So anyway, what we need to do now here is to actually return this promise from here. Okay, because remember, this here will be a new promise. Okay, and so now we need to handle that promise as well. All right, and so the way we do that is to then call another then right here. So we need another callback function. This time let's call it data. And for now, let's log it here to the console. And let's give it a save just to see if it worked. And yeah, here it is. So here we are back to having the same data that we already had before, but this time using a promise. Or actually two promises. So let's recap what happened here. And the first part here, I think, is pretty straightforward, which is this fetch function here returning a promise. And then we handle that promise using the then method, right? But then to actually read the data from the response, we need to call the JSON method on that response object. Now this itself will also return a promise. And so if we then return that promise from this method, then basically all of this becomes a new promise itself. And so since this is a promise, we can then again call the then method on that. And so then again, we have a callback. And this time we get access to the data because the resolved value of this promise here is going to be the data itself. So basically the data that we're looking for, which is then this one here, right? And so now all we have to do is render country of data 0. Okay? And so here it is. So we just did the same thing as before, but using promises. And if we didn't have all of these console.logs here, we could actually simplify this a lot. So let me just copy it so that we get to keep this version as well. But then we can create a highly simplified version as well. So getting rid of this console.log and this one here. And then we can transform these here to arrow functions. And so this is going to work because this one will now implicitly return this result here. So this promise. And so then on that promise, we can call another then method. All I'm doing here is to simplify the code that we already had before. And you see that indeed it still works. So what do you think looks cleaner and nicer? Is it this code here using fetch and promises, or is it this function that we wrote right in the beginning with all of this weird stuff that we have going on here? And with this event and listening for the event, and even worse here with all these nested callbacks. So I hope that you agree that this here is actually a lot nicer. But beside being nicer, the code is also easier to read and to reason about. And as I mentioned before, that in itself is very important. So it's very easy to understand that this fetches something, and then we get a response, which will be transformed to JSON, and then we take that data and render the country to the DOM. Okay, so this almost reads like English sentences, and that's very helpful to understand the code now and also in the future. Now, just to finish, you might be thinking, well, we're still using callbacks here, right? And that is actually true. So promises do not get rid of callbacks, but they do in fact get rid of callback hell. So even if this doesn't look like a big change for now, it will look like a change after we add the functionality of loading the neighbor country like we did in the previous lecture. And so actually, let's go do that now in the next lecture. Let's now learn how to chain promises in order to also render the neighboring country of the initial country that we give to the function. And actually, we already have a small chain of promises because of this JSON function. And so here, these two dens called in sequence are basically already a small chain. But anyway, in this lecture, we will now take chaining to a new level and actually chain together two sequential AJAX calls. So just like before, we first get data about the country, and so that's the part that we already have here. But then we also want to get the data about the neighboring country. And so again, the second AJAX call depends on the data from the first call, and so they need to be done in sequence. So let's simply modify what we already have here. And so the second AJAX call basically needs to happen here in this den handler. So as soon as we get the data, then we need to get the neighbor country and do the AJAX call for that one as well. So let's get the neighbor, and we already know that it is at data 0 at borders, and then also the first one. And just like before, let's say if there is no neighbor, then return immediately. And actually this is not going to work, but never mind about this for now. So we will talk about error handling actually in the next video. Now here there is some kind of problem. We're missing the closing parenthesis here. All right. But now there is no error. And so let's do the second AJAX call. And let me just get the URL from up here. So that's this one. Okay. And so we use again fetch and then the URL. So let's call it country 2 and here country 1. All right. Now for now, this is not going to do anything because what we need to do now is to actually return this new promise. Because then when we do that, we will be able to chain a new den method on the result of this den method. All right. So that's a bit similar to what we did here with the JSON method, which remember also returned the promise. And so we return all of that promise here, and then we can chain a new den method onto that as well. Now in the last lecture, I actually oversimplified how things really work. So actually, the den method always returns a promise, no matter if we actually return anything or not. But if we do return a value, then that value will become the fulfillment value of the returned promise. So let me actually show that to you. So instead of returning this for now, let me just return 23. And so then when I chain a new den method here, let's say data, and then let's alert that data. Let's see. And then indeed we get 23. And so again, that happens because whatever we return from this promise here will become the fulfilled value of the promise. Okay? So again, this here returns a promise, and so we can handle it using the then method. And the fulfilled value, so the success value basically of the promise, will be the value that we return from this then method, right? And so that is this 23 here. And so therefore, in the next then method, then the data here will be 23. And of course, this here must be 23, otherwise we cannot see that in effect. But yeah, so it is 23 because this value is 23. So again, this data that we receive here as an input to this function is the fulfilled value of the promise that we're handling. And so again, that's this value 23 that we are returning from this then method here. Okay, but anyway, of course, the same is true for promises. And so by doing this, so by returning this promise here, then the fulfilled value of the next then method will be the fulfilled value of this previous promise. So of this one. Okay, so I know that sounds confusing, but what you need to understand is that basically this then method here returns a new promise, and here we can then one more time handle the success value of that promise. So one more time, I'm calling this one now a response, because here we are dealing with the fulfilled value of a fetch promise. And so that is a response. And so therefore I like to call it like that. And so here, one more time, we need to call the JSON method. And that is pretty annoying, but that's just how we have to do it. And so here again, the fulfilled value of the promise will become that body. So the data that is stored in the body. And then we can again handle that. So data like this, and then render country with data. And then here again, we pass in that CSS class for the neighbor. Okay, and that should already be it. And indeed, here we go. And if we try something else, let's say Germany, let's see what country we get. And it's Austria. Okay, but anyway, let's just put it back to this one here. And yeah, that's actually it already. So as you can see, promises really allow us to handle these complex asynchronous operations with as many steps as we want. So right now we have 4 steps here even, but of course we could extend this as much as we want. So even if we wanted the neighbor of the neighbor of the neighbor, like 10 countries, we could easily do this by chaining all these promises one after another, and all without the callback hell. So here, instead of the callback hell, we have what we call a flat chain of promises. And this one is, again, very easy to understand and to read. So as a conclusion to this video and the previous one, promises really are an incredibly powerful and elegant solution to handle asynchronous code. Now, just to finish, I want to show you a pretty common mistake that many beginners make, which is to basically chain this then method directly onto a new nested promise. So, as we know, this one immediately returns a promise, and so many beginners basically do this instead. Let me show it to you here. So instead of returning the new promise, they then chain the then method right here. So right inside of this then method. Now this actually does still work, but then we are in fact back to callback hell. Because now indeed we have one callback function here defined inside of another one. So inside of this enclosing callback function. Okay? And so of course, that's exactly what we're trying to avoid. and so don't do this. So always return the promise and then handle it outside by simply continuing the chain like this. All right, but I hope that this was already pretty obvious anyway from all the explanations that I gave you throughout this lecture and the previous one. But anyway, let's now move on and actually handle errors, because that is also a pretty common scenario when we work with promises, and especially with AJAX calls. So until now, we have always assumed that everything went well with our AJAX calls, so we never handled any errors. However, an important part of web development is to actually handle errors, because it's very common that errors happen in web applications. And so in this lecture, let's talk about how to handle errors in promises. And to start, remember that a promise in which an error happened is a rejected promise. And so in this video, we're going to learn how to handle promise rejections. Now, actually, the only way in which the fetch promise rejects is when the user loses his internet connection. And so for now, that's going to be the only error that we will handle here. Now, to simulate losing the internet connection, we can go here to network, and then we can basically change the speed here to offline. However, when we then reload the page, then basically everything will disappear. And so that's not really what we want. We want to simulate that the page was first still loaded, but then as the user does the request without internet, then we want to see the error happening. And so let's set it back to online. And so now what we want to do is to basically only call this function here whenever the user clicks on a button. And so that will then make it easier for us to simulate losing the internet connection. So here in the HTML, we already have a button. So let's comment this one out. And then in the script, I believe, so I already have it here selected as this btn. And so all we will do now is btn.addEventListener, click, and then here function, and just like this. All right. So just to see what happens here. So indeed, that works just fine. But now watch what happens when we set ourselves offline. Let's go back to the console. And so now when we do the request, then we get these errors here. So first, this one here. But the one that's most important is that we now have an on-caught promise. And so, because we have failed to fetch. And so at this point, for the first time, the promise that's returned from the fetch function was actually rejected. And so let's now handle that rejection. Now there are two ways of handling rejections. And the first one is to pass a second callback function into the then method. So the first callback function here is always going to be called for the fulfilled promise, so for a successful one. But we can also pass in a second callback, which will be called when the promise was rejected. So let's do that. And this callback function will be called with an argument, which is basically the error itself. And so let's simply alert the error. All right. So let's try that. Oh, and now we are back to having no internet. So we first need to do everything normally. So load the page. Now we lose the connection. And now we do the request. And so now actually we handled the error by displaying this alert window. And the error that we saw previously down here is now gone. So now, in fact, we no longer have this uncaught error down here because we did actually catch the error right here. So handling the error is also called catching the error. And so again, that's the reason why this error that we had here before disappeared. So it said uncaught error, but again, now we are actually catching it here. And so with this, we are now handling the error that might occur in this promise here. Okay. Now in this case, there are then no more errors because basically the chain stops here when this error happens and when it's handled right here. But now what if there was actually no error in this fetch promise here? So basically, what if this fetch promise was actually fulfilled, but then the second one here was rejected? Well, then we would also have to catch an error here. So we would have to come here, get this function and paste it here, and also handle the error right here. However, that is a little bit annoying, and so in fact, there is a better way of basically handling all these errors globally just in one central place. So instead of all of these callback functions here, let's just delete them. Okay, so this is a lot nicer just having one callback in the den. And then instead, we can handle all the errors no matter where they appear in the chain right at the end of the chain by adding a catch method. And then here we can actually use the same callback function because the callback function here will also be called with the error object that occurred. And so then we can handle it in some way. All right. So again, this catch method here at the end of the chain will basically catch any errors that occur in any place in this whole promise chain, and no matter where that is. So errors basically propagate down the chain until they are caught. And only if they're not caught anywhere, then we get that uncaught error that we saw right in the beginning. All right, so let's now try this again, and we will have to put back the internet, reload the page, get back offline, and indeed, we get the same error now here. So the same alert window that we had before. Now instead of having that annoying alert window, let's just log the error to the console and create some string here. So error, and then let's just add some emojis so that we know exactly which errors were printed by ourselves. Well, let's add a couple of them here. And in fact, we can actually also style this one with console.error. Remember, I think I showed you this one at some point in the beginning of the course. But anyway, usually simply logging the error to the console is not enough in a real application with a real user interface. And so instead of just logging something to the console, let's also display an error message for the user to see. And so that's then a more real use case of this catch block. All right, so I'm adding a new block here. So we still want to, of course, log the error to the console. But besides that, let's actually now create a function that will also render some kind of error. Okay, so let's do that outside here. And I'm calling it render error. So this is a function, and it can take in a message. Just call it like this. And just like the country elements, we want to attach this to country's container and then insert adjacent. And this time not HTML, but insert adjacent text. So this is a new one, but basically it does the same thing as insert adjacent HTML, but simply with text. So it doesn't create any new HTML elements. Okay, and then besides that, remember, we always have to set the opacity back to 1. So just as we did before in the render countries function, because otherwise this container is not even going to be visible. And actually, let's put this function right at the very top of the file together with the render country function. So just like this. Okay, So again, in both cases, in order to actually see the container, we set the opacity to 1. Okay, and so now here, let's use that. Render, so not country, of course, error. Let's say something went wrong. Then here we can use our emoji again. Why not? And then here, let's again print the error. And actually, this error that is generated here is a real JavaScript object. So we can create errors in JavaScript with a constructor, for example, just like a map or a set. And any error in JavaScript that was created like this contains the message property. So we can use that here to basically only print the message of that error and not the whole object itself. And we will actually learn more about the built-in error object of JavaScript in the next video. Now to try this, we need to again get ourselves online. Then offline, check the console. And indeed, we get our custom error down here, visible by the emojis, and then our own message here for the user. Now it's not super pretty, but that's not the point here. And as you see, indeed, this here is simply the error.message, while down here we have the entire error. So that includes the type error, and even it includes this so-called stack trace. So it shows us exactly where the error comes from. All right, and so that's how we handle errors happening in promises in any then handler. So basically handling any promise rejection no matter where it happens in the chain. Now just to finish, there is one more quick method that I want to show you, and that is also available on all promises. So besides then and catch, there's also the finally method. So let's add a finally here. Finally, and then the callback function that we define here will always be called whatever happens with the promise. So no matter if the promise is fulfilled or rejected, this callback function that we define here is going to be called always. So that's the difference between the other two. So the then method is only called when the promise is fulfilled, while this one is only called while the promise is rejected. Now the finally method is not always useful, but sometimes it actually is. So we use this method for something that always needs to happen no matter the result of the promise. And one good example of that is to hide a loading spinner, like these rotating circles that you see everywhere in web applications when you load some data. So these applications show a spinner when an asynchronous operation starts and then hide it once the operation completes. And that happens no matter if the operation was successfully or not. And so for that, the finally method is perfect. And in our case, what we always need to do is to fade in the container. So basically, this part here always happens no matter what, right? So no matter if we render the country in the case of success, or if we render the error in case of an error, no matter what, we always need to do this. And so let's take this out of here. So I'm copying it here and deactivating this in both cases. And then let's put it here into the finally handler. Okay, and now we no longer need the offline. So let's just reload, put it here, and yeah, that works beautifully. Just notice that this actually works because catch itself also returns a promise. So that's the only way why this here can work. So of course, this only works on promises. And so, yeah, again, this can only work if catch itself also returns a promise. All right. Now let's try to simulate another error so that I can show you what we need to do next. So let's say that we're trying to search for a country that simply doesn't exist. And so our API is not going to find any result for that. Let's say just this. So let's see. And well, we get this weird error that we cannot read property flag of undefined in line 152. No, so basically it's coming from this place, but of course then in our stack trace we can see where exactly it's coming from. So it's coming from get country data. Well, in this case it's not that helpful, but sometimes inspecting this stack trace can be helpful indeed. So anyway, this error here is weird, and it doesn't really reflect the true error, which is simply that our API cannot find any country with this name. So the true error is of course not that we cannot read flag of undefined, but in fact it is that our API cannot find any country. And so that's reflected here with the status code of 404. However, as I said in the beginning, the fetch promise only rejects when there is no internet connection. But with a 404 error like this, which is not a real error, but well, it kind of is. But anyway, with this 404, the fetch promise will still get fulfilled. So there's no rejection, and so our catch handler cannot pick up on this error. It does pick up on this other error, so this one here, but that's not the one that we actually want to handle. In this case, we really want to tell the user that no country was found with this name. And so that is what we will do in the next lecture, so that this one doesn't become all too long. So in this lecture, we're going to fix the request 404 error that we saw happening in the last lecture. And so as we saw in the last video, the problem here is that during the fetch, there was a 404 error, which is because our API couldn't find any country with this name. But still, even though there was obviously a big problem with this request, the fetch function still did not reject in this case. And by the way, many people, and that includes myself, think that in this case, the promise should actually be rejected right away. But again, it just doesn't, and so we will have to do it manually. So to see what happens here, let's go back to this first then handler here, which gets access to the response immediately, so without even the data. So here I'm adding back a block, and let's take a look at the response here. And also, since we added back the block, we now need to return this explicitly. So again, for now, we are just taking a look at the response object here. And so here it is. And so right here, you can see that the OK property is set to false. And so the reason for that is, of course, the status code 404. Now, when the request goes well, and so that's what's going to happen when I click here. So then if we take a look at the response, OK is true, and that's because status is 200. And so 200 literally stands for OK. So we can now use the fact that this response has the OK property set to false to basically reject the promise ourselves manually. All right? So we can do that by creating a new error. So we can say if there is no response.ok, or in other words, if response.ok is false, then we write throw new error, and then here we can define an error message. So let's write a very logical message here, which is country not found. So this is the real error message that we want to see here. And of course, not this one here with cannot read property of undefined. And here we can then also take the status code and display it as well. So this 404 in this case. Let's just wrap it here into parentheses. And okay. So this is something that we never did before. So let's analyze what happens here. So we create the new error by using, again, this constructor function basically, and then we pass in a message, which is going to be the error message. Then we use the throw keyword here, which will immediately terminate the current function, so just like return does it. Now, the effect of creating and throwing an error in any of these then methods is that the promise will immediately reject. So basically, the promise returned by this then handler here will be a rejected promise. And that rejection will then propagate all the way down to the catch handler, which we already have set up here. And so now if we would try to reload this, and actually let's do that. So now this error message that we created here, so that's country not found 404. So exactly this is exactly the rejection that we created here by creating this new error. All right. So again, any error that happens in any of the callback functions here, so in any then handler, will immediately terminate that then handler and will propagate down to the catch method here. And then in there, we handle that error. And so therefore, that's why we then see the error here displayed. So that error.message is exactly that message that we pass into the error here. And in fact, the same is true for any other error. So before we had this, the error that we saw was this one here. And that's because somewhere in the render country function, we are trying to read the flag from the data that we received. But the data that we received did not contain this flag. And so therefore it created this error, and then that error caused the rejection of the promise, which was then one more time handled down here. Okay? So again, any error will cause any promise to reject. But here we are simply creating our own error to basically reject the promise on purpose so that we can then handle that error down here in the chain, so in this catch method. All right, but now you might be wondering, why should we even bother handle all these errors? Isn't that just a bunch of work and a waste of time? Well, first, handling these errors is the only way in which we can actually display an error message like this on the screen for the user. But even more important, it's just a really bad practice to leave these rejected promises like hanging around without handling them. So don't do that. Always use catch, and if necessary, you can also use finally. Okay. And now, again, what if there was no error here in this promise? So if we got no problem in this one here, but then we got a problem in the second fetch. So let's say that we don't do this, and so we have a reasonable country, which is Portugal, when we click on the button. But then here, let's say that the neighbor is not this one, but this country code, which I'm sure does not exist. And so now there is going to be a rejection in this promise, right? So we get another error here. In this case, it's a 400 error, which means something else. But in any case, the error is not handled. So we now need to go ahead and copy this code here also into this then handler. Let's actually do that, even though we know it's a bad practice and we need to fix this later. Okay. And so now we get the error message that we want. So again, country not found, and this time with the code 400. But now, of course, we have all this duplicate code here. So we shouldn't have this here. And in fact, even all of this is kind of repetitive. It's really, if you think about it, the same code as this one. And so now I think that it's a good time to actually create ourselves a really nice helper function. And this helper function will wrap up the fetch, the error handling, and also the conversion to JSON. Because in my opinion, it's really a bit cumbersome to having to do all these steps all the time. So having the fetch and then having to convert that response to JSON and only then being able to handle it, right? So instead, we will basically encapsulate all of this here into one nice function. So let's do that. And I'm going to call it getJSON. So basically, because it gets data and it immediately converts it to JSON. Now, what do we need here as parameters? Well, for sure, we need the URL. And so for now, that's okay here. So let's get, or actually we can just write it. So what we want here is fetch, and then the URL that we pass into the function. And then on that, we want to call then, and then basically with all of this. So let's grab it here. And of course, we are missing the callback function itself here. So that should end somewhere here. And, well, apparently it doesn't. Maybe like this. And yes, that's correct. All right. Now, in order to actually make this function here really generic, we do not want to hardcode the error message, but instead we want to pass the message in. So let's say error message, and we can set a nice default value. So let's say something went wrong, which again is very generic. And so here inside of this, we then want the error message that we pass in and along with response.status. Okay, and now all we need to do is to return all of this. And so like this getJSON function will actually return a promise. And so this is then just like any other promise that we can call here in our chain and basically replace all of this. So just so we can keep this code, I'm going to copy it. And so you can then keep this code here basically as a reference for when you need to study it again. Okay, but again, I will now go ahead and take everything that we just nicely encapsulated into our getJSON function and simply replace this. So getJSON, and then the URL is this one. And the error message is country not found. All right. And so now we can take away all of this. So this is already in our getJSON function, and so we don't need this. All right. And now the same down here. Instead of fetch, we can get JSON, and then we don't need this then here. And again, the error message is country not found. Okay, and so let's get rid of this.